That worked. Okay. Why is authoritarianism such an alluring solution for an individual and her or his followers? That's my first question. And this question should be of no surprise to anybody, given the times we are living in, with an apparent resurgence of authoritarianism within the general population. An alluring solution, is it, for the individual? Yes, very much so. And I will explain why. And my perspective is that the precursors for such a mindset, authoritarian mindset, starts early in life. And I will try to convey some of the psychological conditions that may instigate the authoritarian thinking later in life, which again may contribute to authoritarian ideology in the population. And some might react negatively to such an endeavor, because one could argue that authoritarianism is not an individual problem. Is it at any point in psychologizing something which is such a complex political and social problem? But as long as we agree that society consists of individuals, and thoughts originate in an individual's mind, of course, one cannot say that it is not relevant for society what people think. Theodor Adorno, the philosopher, argued just after World War II that Narcissism preconditioned that a sufficient number of the population had an authoritarian personality, or the reverse, a submissive one. Hitler would have not won what was a fair democratic election in 1933 without voters having authoritarian and submissive dispositions. The reason for the development of authoritarian attitudes have, after the Second World War, been analyzed from an economic, social, historic, evolutionary, biological, migration-related, religious perspective. But the individual,
Turid, I'm sorry to interrupt, but your presentation froze on introduction. Are you scrolling down or?
No, I'm still there. The individual psychological conditions are fairly seldom discussed. And that's why I'm having this talk at this webinar. So, Monica, here comes the next point on my slide. Sorry for the long introduction. Can a mental technique like Acem Meditation be an antidote to authoritarian and controlling mindset? And the answer to that second question is yes. That I can say right away. Of course it is. And I will tell you why later. But first, a definition of what authoritarian personality is. It is not, let's see what happens here. Just adjust the picture here a bit. Sorry for this. Okay, so I can see my slide properly. The authoritarian personality, what is it? It is not a personality disorder. It's not a diagnosis. It's simply a rather unlucky bundle of some personality traits. Okay, which traits are they? We have a trait of being quite control-minded, hierarchical. An authoritarian person is very loyal, especially loyal to authorities. And in that sense, also submissive to authorities. But submissiveness is also expected from those who have a lower rank. We have a person with authoritarian traits, tends to be contemptuous, having contempt for those who deviate from idealized norms. Theodor Adorno, the philosopher which I just mentioned, explains how the psyche of the authoritarian attaches itself to figures of strength, or what one thinks is strength, and disdains those who are considered to be weak. And also the trait of being attracted to simple ideologies, simple values, simple solutions.
Yeah.
We have some additional authoritarian traits. Suppression of shortcomings. Authoritarian people are not very preoccupied with their shortcomings. They don't hardly even tolerate them. Their personality is rather rigid. They're not flexible. They have stereotypical thinking. They forget the nuances. It's black or white. They are attracted to conspiracies. And they have such a stark contrast between in and out group. In group is people who belonging to your own group, your own religion, your own ideology, and the out group are all the others. And you tend to be critical of those in the out group as a means to strengthen the cohesion in the in group. Some with an authoritarian personality or with these bundle of personality traits have some additional, which can make them quite actually dangerous. Narcissistic traits, grandiosity as such isn't necessarily dangerous, but when it's coupled with other things, it can be pretty tricky. They can have paranoid tendencies, and some have psychopathic personality traits. Leaders, authoritarians who are leaders in public or executive positions, who have narcissistic traits. They're assertive. They're not afraid to make decisions. They can be charismatic. And many are attracted to their steadfast self-confidence and misinterpret it as a psychological strength. They don't see that the person with this inflated self-confidence masks a sensitivity to criticism, a vulnerability. They are easily offended and they hit back quickly. They are always in the right and therefore never apologize, even when it would be reasonable to do so. They only surround themselves with people who confirm their exalted self-image. They are masters at seeing others' shortcomings and know, if necessary, how to exploit them. The control orientation also largely involves controlling others. The control orientation also has its parallel in authoritarian or totalitarian states. A totalitarian regime would work best if the authorities were able to build control into the individual citizen. That is, by making the individual an active supporter of the official ideology. For this reason, totalitarian regimes place great emphasis on having full control over upbringing, education, media, dissemination of information, and the arts. And what about the followers? Who are the people who are impressed, seduced, entertained, who admire and cheer on the authoritarians? They vote for them and give them leadership positions, thinking they're strong. Is it most people with a normal balance between self-confidence and self-doubt? Or is it the braggers? In fact, it has been shown in research that those who are most easily seduced by leaders with authoritarian and narcissistic traits are people who have lower self-esteem than others and who are slightly more likely to be a little anxious or depressed. Other personality traits which are typical of followers of authoritarians is actually compassion. You are generally then a friendly and agreeable person, and then you avoid conflict, and you don't challenge the opinion of others, and especially in a narcissistic leader. In order to understand the consequences of narcissistic authority, we can also draw on some perspectives from developmental psychology. Feelings of inferiority and compensating wishes of being something greater, but have not achieved it. Those fantasies then don't disappear. They're just transferred among the followers to someone else. If you can't become invincible yourself, someone else maybe can't. The child identifies with their role models, usually their parents, who are their ideals for a while when they're very young. They become the opposite when they get older. And it's the same thing with the adults. They identify with the ideal, and the ideal's achievement, be it a pop singer, be it a football star, sort of trickles down a bit to the grown-up or to the child. This is a normal phenomenon in children to get attached to their ideals. But when it continues in adulthood, when childhood fantasies are reactivated through an ideal, when everything feels so much better, as long as one can be in the role model's sphere, be it physically or in one's mind, you can describe it as a form of vicarious narcissism. You can take part in something that you don't have yourself. There's nothing wrong, and there's nothing pathological in this. But the danger is that it can entrench the person in an immature position, that you need an ideal in order to maintain some or better self-esteem. people are often willing to give up some of their health, autonomy, in order to be liked and recognized by the narcissistic authority. To illustrate my point, I'm going to illustrate this. I'm going to talk a bit about two life narratives, two boys, their lives, their destinies, and they both ended up with the same solution. Vera Putina was a very poor, hardworking Georgian woman who came forth in 2002 and said she was the mother of Vladimir Putin. She said his father was a Russian soldier who happened to pass by and disappeared again. And Vladimir was most certainly not very welcome to the single woman who could barely feed herself. Still, Vladimir grew up with Vera the first years, and it is documented that a child named Vladimir Putin was enrolled at the local school there in this small town in Georgia until he was 10 years old. Then he was taken out of school. Vera said she could no longer cope with him because Vladimir was a difficult boy, always getting into trouble. She sent him alone from Georgia to Leningrad. She had managed to find his father's parents, but they had never heard of this boy and denied he was their grandchild. So he was put up for adoption. In Putin's official biography, his adoptive parents are stated that they were his biological parents. But this biography says just about nothing about Putin's first 10 years. When some media started writing about Vera Putina, the KGB turned up at her doorstep. They took all her photos and never gave them back. They took blood samples with her DNA, but never revealed the results. Two journalists, one from Chechnya, the other one from Italy, independent of each other, and a couple of years apart, interviewed Vera and did extensive research on the matter. Just before they were going to publish, they died in what seems like manipulated accidents. After their offices had been raided and all documents stolen, nobody knows for sure if Vera really was Putin's mother. And it has not been confirmed that he was adopted. His parents, if they were biological or not, or adopted, both died before he became president. But nevertheless, the Vladimir that Vera had did not have an easy childhood, regardless if he was the president or not. She had one big wish. That was to see her son again and tell him face to face that she was sorry that she had sent him away that time when he was 10 years old. She never got a chance to do so. She died in December last year. This was written in an obituary to Vera Putina in The Economist last year. The second boy I'm going to talk about lived in a quite different part of the world. An American psychologist wrote a book 4 years ago. Too Much and Never Enough was the title. It was about the childhood of another neglected boy. He, however, grew up in a very rich family. He was number 4 of 5 siblings. His father had built up a real estate empire and had no time for his children. The author of the book described the father as a sociopath. That is, a psychopath who is well adapted or fairly well adapted to society. This father wanted his oldest son, Fred, who was named after himself, to take over his empire and to become, as tough as a killer. He used to say, tough enough to make it in the New York business jungle. But Freddie was a sensitive boy and was ridiculed by his father for being so. When Fred was 10 years old, he had 2 younger brothers. One was 2 years old. That was Donald. And another one, Robert, was only 9 months old. When their mother became seriously ill and had several operations and long periods in hospitals and could no longer take properly care of her children. The author of the book, which many of you may recognize, was Mary Trump, the niece of Donald Trump, and the daughter of the older brother, Fred. There was no kind nanny in their house to look after these children. Only a maid who had more than enough, keeping the 23 rooms in the house in order, and a grandmother who was just as cold and hard as her son, which was the father of the children. According to the author of the book, the children were largely neglected after their mother's illness. And the 2-year-old reacted to the absence of his mother and the rejecting father with the only defense he had at his disposal, and that was being angry. His surroundings were harsh and unfriendly, so he became unfriendly. His anger was also a defense against being overwhelmed by insecurity, feelings of abandonment and despair that any 2-year-old without caregivers would naturally feel. In addition, on an almost daily basis, he witnessed how his father mocked, bullied, and devalued his older brother, Freddie, who became an anxious child. This made the father even more contemptuous because it confirmed his perception that Freddie was weak. This was a school of life for little Donald. He certainly wasn't going to be like his brother Freddie. Instead, he became like his father, unruly, difficult, and was just as bullying toward his little brother as his father was to his older brother. By the age of 13, he had become such a difficult child that the parents saw no other solution than to send him off to a military boarding school. Donald Trump tried to stop the publishing of his niece's Mary's book about the family. She had the information about her father's and Donald's early life from their mother, who was sorry that she hadn't been able to take better care of her children. Among other things, she described Donald as so smart that he could get away with anything, even murder. Those were her words. Here are pictures of them. I guess you can see who is Donald and who is Vladimir. Let me emphasize, far from all difficult children end up as authoritarian narcissists. And not all authoritarian leaders have had a difficult upbringing. But adversity in childhood increases the probability. Okay, let's look at the psychological perspectives. Leaders, like all of us, were once upon a time the smallest in a family, until younger siblings came along. One is then not only the smallest in size, one is also the one who understands the least, who knows the least, can manage the least, can do the least, and is most vulnerable and most insecure and most at mercy of adults. But with supportive parents, most people come out of this with a reasonably stable sense of self. And children are also wisely geared, even if they are the smallest, or no matter if there's lots of adversity or not. They create a comforting world in their imagination, where they are big, powerful, magical. They have magical superpowers. Playtime in kindergarten is full of little supermen and princesses. The entire Marvel movie universe plays on such fantasies that even adults get carried away. In their imagination, young children can balance the feeling of being smallest and stupidest with admirable acts of heroism. This is normal development. Children's awareness of a discrepancy between a realistic self and this ideal self does not begin until they're 7, 8 years old. Younger children than that are actually Superman or Catwoman or whatever in play and need to be so to build up a balanced sense of self. However, when there is a lot of adversity in a child's surroundings, it is far more difficult for them to let go of the heroic fantasies and face the reality, which is a gradual process for any normal child. But it's more difficult for those who are living in a difficult environment because the reality is painful. So the child develops a false self, which is nourished by the grandiose childish fantasies. It is a great relief to be somebody else than that person who is vulnerable and inferior. The problem is only that everyone else around you also have to see you the way you want to be seen. They need to see a tough guy and not a wimp. And jacking up your own ego becomes a way of trying to convince others. And the need then for confirmation from others that you're not a wimp becomes insatiable. Not everyone manages to suppress the wimp feelings inside. Not everyone manages to convince their peers either. It's a lot to deal with for a troubled child. Such a child also uses other strategies to not feel too unsafe, too exposed. And what do? They try to control others so that no one will see under their skin. And for this, they have well-used strategies at their disposal, among others, picking on others. Those who are smart develop their own ability to see other people's sore points and use them to put themselves in a superior position. Then the bully is born. Perhaps the narcissist too. And thus, a pretty good breeding ground is established for an authoritarian behavior. Okay, back to Vlad and Don. When parents are neglectful or abusive, children identify with the parent enemy. Donald identified with his father and wanted to be like him, just as controlling, bullying, and unempathetic, to make himself, of course, less vulnerable. Such a defense solution is often called identification with the aggressor. And actually, Donald's father liked Donald's rudeness. He liked Donald's toughness. He even encouraged it. Big brother Freddie chose a different solution. He submitted to his father. He tried to meet his father's demands, which he was unable to do, but was nevertheless obedient and dutiful in the hope of one day winning his father's approval. That is a kind of vicarious narcissism for Fred, until he started realizing it and decided to become a pilot instead of taking over the company as his father had wanted. But Freddie was still unhappy and died of alcoholism at the age of 43. Vladimir, on the other hand, didn't have any father. At least not a father he knew. Children often create parent figures in their imagination. They are big and strong, and they are proud of their child, and the parents, fantasy parents, are somebody which a child can be proud of. We don't know if Vladimir had a fantasy father figure. What we do know is on his career ladder through the KGB and then politics, he was always very loyal to his male superiors, who then again quickly promoted him. Okay. When an authoritarian ideology becomes an ego project, it becomes difficult. The short-grown boy from very modest circumstances became a controlling and cold mini Tsar with visions that the entire Russian Empire must be restored to its former glory. A neglected, bullying son of a rich man developed a compensatory grandiosity, and the entire USA has become his extended ego and must be made great again. If an ideology becomes an extension of a person's own need for a bigger ego and is permeated by the person's own strong compensatory urges, of course, to mask an early vulnerability. The ideology must also then, of course, be defended blind. The realization of the ideology becomes nothing less for the person than an existential struggle. And ideology, no matter which one, can always be tainted with an egocentric project to raise one's own self-esteem. And such tainted ideologies often lead to more political or religious polarization because opponents become ultimately a threat to one's self-worth. This in turn reinforces the in-group and out-group mentality, which was mentioned. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who also was preoccupied with these topics, wrote a book in 1951, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and believed that it is primarily self-interest that governs totalitarian leaders. And that has also been documented later in research within political psychology, that more than demographic factors, the choice of ideology depends on our subjective needs, how we perceive ourselves, interpret ourselves, and the world around us. So the boys developed defense mechanisms, authoritarian grandiosity against past psychological injuries. There were narcissistic defenses against early injuries, vulnerability. And the authoritarian solution is often control, as I mentioned, controlling others, controlling your surroundings, and controlling your mind. Control is king. External control, or internal control, excuse me, and censorship easily lead to external dictatorship. Adorno said that the authoritarian mind is a pre-political mind. So easy do these internal solutions transfer to external reality. One can allow oneself the thought that there are not only parallels between inner and outer, but also that they influence each other, without necessarily saying that that influence is causal. Navalny was secretly murdered in a hidden, frost-bitten labor camp in Siberia. The Nobel Prize winner, Li Xiaobo, also died in a labor camp. He had gotten cancer and didn't receive any treatment. Like so many others, they died in prison. Does anybody think that the arrest changed their mind? Does anybody think that they are less influential after their death? Most dictators probably do. Their thoughts were and are dangerous for the society in which they lived. So dangerous that these minds had to be killed. Of course, thoughts can change societies. All dictators know. What can we do? Whatever we might be doing, we should at least do more. At the very least, many of us are doing something every day with our brains. And now I come to the second part of this talk. Take a quick look. We're going to look at a form of non-directed meditation called Acem Meditation. Why? Because you do something with your mind when you meditate. The conflict between control-mindedness and the freedom of the mind is there, inside us. It's not only outside there in society, it's inside us. And we also see it and meet it when we meditate. Because what do we do with when we practice a non-directed meditation technique, as Acem meditation is? It stimulates mind wandering, the freedom of thought. And mind wandering, again, may also remind us of the unwanted elements within. How do we deal with them? How do we deal also with psychological pain, our everyday problems? Adorno also discussed whether mankind at large had the seeds of authoritarianism in them, the will to power, the wish to be in control, have it my way, be admired. I agree. And Acem meditation makes us more aware of these strategies. Most of them are also avoidance strategies. Acem meditation's freedom of thought would surely have been regarded as, for Acem as such, as a foreign hostile agency and forbidden in most authoritarian states. The groundwork of democracy starts in the heads of its citizens. That is why Putin and Xi are indoctrinating the benefits of internal and external control in all children. But it's in there. As Adorno said, it's in there in our minds too. The propensity to control. You can call it the drones of your mind. You don't notice even that they're there. They're so silent. But they are monitoring what we're doing, what is stirring inside, without we realizing it. Sadly, some meditation techniques advocate the necessity of having such a drone in your head, which monitors everything that goes on inside. They call it being mindful of yourself. All of us, I think with no exception, have an unconscious and well-elaborated propensity to avoid something we do not want in ourselves. We certainly don't notice that in our everyday lives, but we do meet it in our meditation. In meditation, the propensity to avoidance is expressed as concentration, albeit also unconscious, that is trying to control somehow. And that is why meditation guidance from time to time is often necessary to discover our blind spots. And I just want to mention, we're coming to the end now, that what we are avoiding is often things which we are not too, are disturbing or a little painful. Psychological strength is not about avoiding being able to avoid it. It's about being able to contain the pain. It may hurt, but it's bearable. It does increase our empathy towards others who are unfortunate. It also builds resilience, this ability to tolerate what you are and who you are. And it does enrich emotional depth. Suppressing pain drains you. Suppression is conscious. You do it willingly, putting the painful things aside because you have to function, you have to be at work, you have to do what you have to do. And that can be a strength, but not as a life rule. We also have repression, which is the same as suppression, it's just unconscious. It is automated, but it still drains your energy without you realizing it. And often suppression and repression are seldom sufficient. Most often one resorts to also projections, which really makes our relationships difficult. Okay. We are now about to reach the end. Be a good parent or a grandparent. On the world scene, extremely fearless can make a difference. As a parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle, or neighbor, or whatever we are when we are around children, we can really make a difference for them. We can be an alternative adult. We can contribute to minimize the chance that we are breeding a generation who will follow narcissistic leaders. Secondly, we can all mend our minds with non-directive meditation, with Acem Meditation. The free mental attitude we practice and the neutral meditation sound are all the tools you need to keep your brain healthy and freedom-loving. And that brings us to the last slide. We usually don't make political jokes in such a setting, so forgive me for this one. But we are at the brink of a new one. Many of us believe a new world war. We have several wars going on. Somebody has to stop the bad guys. Somebody has to stop the aggressors in time. That is one lesson we all should have learned after World War II. And since I've been talking about such dire subjects, so I would like to also let you leave with maybe some have a smile on their face after these 45 minutes, at the risk of maybe annoying someone. So forgive me for that. With the breathless anticipation, the crowd awaits the unveiling of the Donald Trump statue. Okay, I see some people smile. Thank you so much for your attention.